Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Well Versed, the podcast. As you can see, this is another week with a guest. Our guest is the one, the only, Robert.
Hello.
Hello.
How's it going, guys?
It's going well. Robert, tell us a little about yourself. Who are you?
I'm Robert.
Step one.
I used to be Tony a couple of years ago, but now I'm not anymore. So I was the youth pastor at PBPC for a while. Tony was actually in my youth group.
It's true.
Grant was there helping out at the time.
It's true.
So, yeah. And now I was away from the church for a little while. I'm back now doing stuff at the church again.
Sweet.
And now I'm on your podcast.
Isn't it crazy how life works that way?
Truly the crowning achievement in your career up to this point.
High point of my life.
And I will also say Robert and I have been close friends for over a decade at this point.
Since early high school.
Since early high school.
And now we're old.
And obviously we were co-workers together for many years. So it's always good to see you.
Yeah, you too.
Well, before I announce the topic of this week's episode, because no one read the title of the video, I'm sure, before jumping into this, Grant, Robert, would you guys define yourselves as young people?
I mean, I don't know if I've ever defined myself as a young person, even when I was maybe in that category.
It's true. It's true.
You know, we both, if you don't want me to share this, we can cut this, but we both crossed the threshold in the 30s at this point.
I've heard a lot of censoring, don't worry about it.
I don't want to disappoint my fans by being old.
So I think obviously being in your 30s, even your young 30s, is sort of like on the threshold, depending on what context you're talking about, right?
Sure.
In the context of Pacific Beach Presbyterian Church, we are very much young people.
Yeah, that's true.
Fair enough.
You know, in the context of youth group, of course, we're very much old people because, we've been out of high school for well over a decade at this point.
That's fair. Well, so the question is, and again, nobody knows this because nobody read the title of the episode, is church still relevant to young people today? And the reason I ask if you two are young people, I'm kind of curious on how much stake you two have in this conversation. I feel like I'm firmly in the young person camp still. Even in the youth group, I still feel like a young person occasionally.
Yeah. You're younger than a lot of your volunteers.
It's true.
Most.
5 of the 6, right? But yeah. So in the context of that conversation, would you guys describe yourself would you guys think that you two would still belong to a young adult ministry?
So actually, I have been thinking about that because we have roots here, and we've always talked about that as being a young adult ministry. But then I've honestly been wondering, is that even me anymore? But as Grant said a moment ago, in the context of this church, the answer is yes, because the alternative is a lot older. But another thing for me personally is that I think I've always been kind of immature for my age. And I'm not even really saying that as a diss against myself, I just think it's true. So it's I relate pretty well, I think, to people a couple of years younger than me. So in that sense, I feel pretty comfortable around young adults. But yeah, age-wise, having just turned 30, I'm not crazy young anymore. But
Fair enough. How about yourself?
Yeah, I mean, unlike Robert, I've often felt old for my age.
Sure.
Not just from a maturity perspective, but I think, again, in most contexts, 30 is not particularly young anymore. In our context, it is.
Sure.
I don't know, though. I don't want to overstate the case of 30 not being young, because I think, for as much as, you're no longer a teen or in your 20s, there's definitely for most people, hopefully, there's still way more life ahead of you than what's come behind. So you're still in the first half of your life.
Sure. Well, fair enough. So then the question still stands. Now we can actually jump into it. Is church still relevant to young people today? And I think that actually asks a further clarification of when we say is church still for young people, are we talking about being a part of church? Are we talking about going to a church service? So why don't we start there, actually? Is church services as they're traditionally imagined still relevant and valuable to young people today?
Okay, I have thoughts on that actually, which is good because I might have suggested this topic. But okay, I think that I think church can and should be timeless. However, I think that it's in practice right now, it might not be in many cases, and it might be just lagging behind culture too much, especially because with like, at least when you get to Zoomer culture, which is like the first generation younger than me, that I feel out of touch with,
Right.
it's like...
Zoomer here.
Yeah.
Oh.
So you can weigh in on this, but it's very different in a lot of ways, I think. And you even I relate to more because you're like an older side of Zoomer.
Mm-hmm.
But like, I've done a little bit of research on the whole generation thing. I had to do that for my previous job a little bit, and it's like millennials were kids who were like, technology started to become huge in like the internet when they were pretty young. And it's like I used the internet when I was like 11, maybe a little bit, like a tiny little bit.
Sure.
And then I don't know, once I was like in high school, the internet was common, but like I remember when YouTube started existing, which is probably weird to young people, and stuff like that, and like the pre-YouTube internet of Homestar Runner, I remember that distinctly. But anyway, it's like Zoomers are supposed to be the people who like, it was just always there. Like they didn't have a childhood and then bam, there's the internet, it's just like the internet has always been life. And it's like, I think, because like I think Grant and I have probably talked about it in the past, but it's like, old people, like millennials and older, it's like we think like, oh, well, there's real life and then there's the internet. But it's like for, I think like Zoomers and like younger Zoomers, it's just like, there's no distinction between that. Like a lot of real life is the internet and they are one and the same. And it's like, maybe there's some like really hip churches that are like really internet savvy, but I think like in a lot of ways, like older people can easily be like, oh, this is kind of a fad, you know, like thinking the internet is the same as real life. Like that's not, like I know that's not true because I was around before the internet, but it's like, if that's just how life is now and how it's going to keep being, like I think you have to adjust. Like you can't just be like, it's the children who are wrong, you know? Like you have to actually like meet them where they're at, I think. And I'm not confident that churches are doing a great job of that yet, but I can't obviously speak definitively on that. That's just the feeling that I get.
Sure. Let me ask you, so how, you don't have to have all the answers, of course.
Yeah.
Let's talk about what that might look like, because I think, you know, again, as someone who runs a church service and is heavily involved in church life and work, you know, I'm very curious to know like what kind of suggestions there might be out there to do that in such a way that doesn't compromise the very nature of what church is, but keeps up with culture and how things are moving.
So, before I say anything about that, I would be interested to hear from Tony on what I said, just because he's younger. I don't know. What do you think about any of that?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that I think the modern church has done a really poor job of being present in a lot of the things that seem like commonplace or normal or important to me as a Zoomer.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, if anybody's watching and doesn't know what that means, Gen Z.
Gen Z.
Yeah, Generation Z.
The generation that came after millennials.
Yep.
People born roughly around the turn of the century and after.
Yeah, basically those in their 20s and graduating high school right now. Older high schoolers and people in their 20s right now. But yeah, I mean, I'm a firm believer that the church needs to do a better job of being where the people are in general. And I think as a Gen Z person, especially as someone that went through public school, there's this very big culture of like the church is nowhere I want to be.
Right.
And I'm like a firm, and this is opinion I hold for like the church and video gaming, or the church and like nerd culture, or the church and a lot of things. It's just that, like the places that I am as a person, the church often isn't, and I have to go out of my way to like experience church rather than the church coming to me.
I think that's significant.
Yeah.
For a specific reason, but I'm not going to cut you off.
Well, I mean that kind of is not my only, but the bulk of my reaction to kind of what you said.
Yeah.
But I am curious as to Grant's question of like what the church could do differently, because I have a few ideas, but not many, to be honest.
Yeah, so I haven't totally thought that through, but I think what you just said is a big part of it, which is like the church being where the people are.
Mm-hmm.
And rather than just like expecting people to come to the church, and this is something else that I was thinking of, is like another huge generational shift is that like not that long ago, I don't know, a lot of people just went to church, or their family did, or like got invited to church or something. Like there's some crazy stat I don't remember, but it's like I think like more than half of teens go to a Christian youth group at some point in like their high school years, which is crazy. It's like a lot of people go at least once. But it's like, I think as time goes on, and especially if there's this problem of like the church isn't where the people are and where the young people are, it's just not going to happen as much. And I think it's already like a lot of people's like parents just don't go to church. Like there's a lot of, I don't know if you guys have heard the phrase like nuns, religious nuns.
Yeah.
It's not a Catholic thing. There's no U in that word.
N-O-N-E.
N-O-N-E. And they're people who are not atheists or agnostics, but they are not religious at all. When they just say they have no religious affiliation. They don't even care about religion enough to be anti-religion. They just don't care about it at all. And that's a lot of people. That's a growing number of people. I don't remember all the stats. It's been a while since I looked at it, but I know that it's just like a large and growing group. And it's like if the church wants these nuns to care about anything churchy, they can't really expect them to come knocking on the door and be like, hey, give me some church. You know, like, you're probably going to have to actually reach out to them, is my thought.
So let me ask, this is a question for both of you, because I think that what you guys are talking about just then is something that's been true, certainly of our millennial generation as well. Like, you know, it may be a bigger problem now than it was, but it was still a big problem when you and I were growing up. And there's, you know, there are definitely things out there like, you know, we do theology on tap and stuff like that, where it's like it maybe aims more towards the millennials of trying to be where they are. So what are some places that we could be where Gen Zers, Zoomers, or whatever comes after them are that the church isn't right now?
Oh man, that's a great question, and I honestly don't know. I don't know, like, if I'm atypical as a Gen Zer, or if like we just don't have like traditional gathering places. At least
that's actually what I was thinking.
Yeah, like I don't know, like I don't know like where the church needs to be necessarily, but I think a good first step is the church. I feel like there's a culture of like the church judging a lot of like what I as a Gen Z person am like into, which is really like video gaming and I don't even know whatever else, to be honest. I'm a very one-dimensional person that really cares about video gaming.
So Robert, talk a little bit more about what you want, like your take on the not having spaces as Gen Zers.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of aspects to this issue, but I think like one of the most honest answers to the question of like where are all the Gen Zers, I think they're at home on their computer. So it's like you can't just go to all their houses and like get them to do something together or whatever. But it's like even like COVID kind of made this a thing for everyone of all generations. Just online gatherings became a huge thing now. But like for people younger than a certain age, I think like that's the norm. And it's like because like kids in our youth group, for example, who are teenagers, they just like on a very regular basis, they're just all at their own houses and they're using Discord and they're playing video games together. It's like in my day, literally the newest game console I owned came out in 2001. It did not have online play, the Nintendo GameCube. And if you playing video games with your friends was they're at your house or you're at their house or whatever. Like a lot of things were just in person because the internet was kind of in its infancy at the time. But it's like now there are so many ways to connect online, and like it's not a given that you're leaving your house to hang out with your friends or that they're coming over or whatever. It's like you can all just be in your room alone, physically alone, but like with people. But it's like, I think that's why, I don't know, like they're not all at the local soda shop on Friday night, you know? Like you can't just like find a offline gathering of them necessarily to like get their attention.
Yeah.
So then I think that's when it's like, Tony was saying, it's like the church maybe needs to get to where they are, which is probably online.
Yeah, so let's talk about that a little bit more, because obviously during the pandemic, a lot of churches shifted to some version of online, but like I know like what our church did, both Sunday morning and for Roots, right? It was centered around like YouTube or another like video type thing, and then Zoom, like gatherings. But that's really just like recreating church spaces as best as possible in the digital space, not inhabiting digital spaces that are like inherent to and natural to young people, right? That was very much like putting church methods onto the internet. So how do we break out of that mindset and do it better? And I speak as someone who, as you guys both know, is an absolute Luddite and doesn't do the internet well. I'm very much more a boomer when it comes to my relationship to the internet than a millennial.
Man, I'm going to speak to something I might not understand. So if I sound silly, you can make fun of me appropriately. And social convention will kick in, I realize. But I think the church needs to re-embrace a discipleship culture. And what I mean by that is I think the church cannot think of reaching Gen Z or filling a digital space as like getting as many Christians into one space as possible to like fill digital space or provide as many things as possible. I think what it really needs to look like is like the church investing in individuals as people and building up, I don't know, like online, I don't want to say like online ministers, but I think it's like just forming really strong like small tight relationships with a few people and letting their personal relationships kind of like spread the church online, if you will, which I think is more effective than like having Zoom calls people can plug into or having like a really well-produced Instagram like church thing. I think it's really just about having like quality Christian relationships and letting those take place online. I don't know if that even makes sense, but
yeah. I think it's funny, like, this is slightly off topic, but it's kind of the way a lot of things are moving online, where it's like with marketing and branding and stuff, a lot of it's becoming like influencer based.
Yeah.
And it's like instead of a major brand just like paying $1 zillion for like a Super Bowl spot or whatever, they pay some person who has a lot of followers just to like talk about their product, and they connect to an audience directly through a person who people like. So like,
yes.
And I'm not saying that the church has to like sponsor literal influencers, but I think the general theory is happening a lot online, and it's like there's still a personal aspect even though it's through a computer or whatever.
Yeah, and this might be like a generational divide, because that's not like shocking to me at all. Like, to me, it's weird that people would think like that's impersonal.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, and I mean, on that note, I also think that like, at least to my generation and probably to the generation that follows, Gen Alpha, learned that recently. I think there's been some damage done, and I think there needs to be some healing done before things like feel more like normal again. And by that, I mean, I don't think my generation like necessarily even wants to be a part of the church or wants to like pursue Christianity or other like faith-based environments. Because I think we've just been like taught and conditioned like, oh, that's weird. Oh, they don't like the things that you like. Like you don't fit into their like cookie cutter mold.
Yeah, which is probably true in some cases.
Yeah, and I think if there were like a cabal of that, if we can censor that one, that would be great. No, but I think if there were like positive Christian influence online, I think that would be huge in healing the damage done. Long before we like create spaces that people would want to like be a part of, I think we need to like change the culture of like that like people don't want to be part of the church and the church doesn't want them necessarily. Cool example of that. I was at a faith club today, like on a high school campus, right?
Nice.
And we had like a bunch of free pizza, and kids would like come in and be like checking us out, like, oh, what is this? Like free pizza? That's awesome. And then like they would like take their slice and be like, oh, like what's this all about? And when we're like, oh, like we're just a faith club, we're just trying to do something cool for y'all, just like give out pizza.
That's kind of like the bottle service?
Yeah, a lot like the bottle service. And we get a lot of similar reactions where people are like, oh shoot, like I'm sorry, do you want this back? This is not, like I'm not really for that, like this is not for me. Like I'm not that kind of person. And we have to be like, no, like that's not the point. Like this is just for you, like enjoy your pizza. like we're good. And it wasn't even like them like turning around, walking out because like they didn't want to be a part of what we were doing. It was just like implicit, like, oh, they're not church people, like they shouldn't be engaging with this church activity. And I think that's like the damage that needs to be like healed before we even consider like how can the church be more present for them. I don't even know if like that makes sense either. But I think that there's like a lot of challenges to ministering to Gen Z.
Like I think there's a lot of like just long-standing ideas associated with Christianity, like various like moral standards and like certain just like, I don't know, views about society that people think are always associated with Christianity, and then they think like, well, if I don't agree with that, or if I don't live according to that, then clearly I'm not welcome in any kind of Christian place.
Right.
And like, I don't know, like, because like certain kinds of Christians like would see that as a good thing, where it's like, oh, we gotta like uphold the moral standard. And I used to think that way in kind of a major way, where I thought it's like, oh, like if you're a Christian, you're like a defender of like truth and morality and all this stuff. And like, I think that's true to an extent, but there's like the flip side of that is like, I can't remember the verse, but Paul said something about how like, if you're not going to hang out with anyone in the world who is sinful, then you'd have to go out of the world, because that's everyone. So it's like the church needs to like figure out how to not appear so judgmental that they're like pre-rejecting everyone. which I'm not saying it's like all the church's fault, and like there could be like cultural things and like, I don't know, but I think that's something that would need to change, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, clearly, I think no matter what generation you're from, unfortunately, the church has a reputation that's not always undeserved of being a place of like judgment and hypocrisy first, and then of like love, acceptance, those sorts of things.
Right.
Like second at best, you know?
Right.
It's like
if you are this way, then you are loved.
Right.
Yeah.
Something else that came to mind is sort of a change of topic, but I'm curious, and maybe this is more directed to you. So like the buzzword for like millennials, like trying to reach them for church, was always authenticity, right? Like being your true self, right? Like they wanted to get rid of the like trappings and the like people being fake nice and that kind of stuff, and like a lot of millennials actually enjoyed like high church, like liturgy and stuff, but done in such a way that it was like, again, people were being authentic within it and didn't like the sort of like fake church nice. Now, I don't know if that's still true for Gen Zers. So I'm curious, like, do you think that that is still something that matters the way that it mattered for millennials? And B, if so or if not, like what else matters to Gen Zers in a way that it doesn't maybe for other generations?
Yeah, I mean, this is weird for me. I acknowledge that I am not the standard Gen Zer, especially with my relationship to the church, right?
Yeah, considering you already work at one.
You know, I work at one, you know, the church got me early, whatever you want to say. But if I were to try and like step into the shoes of my peers a little bit, I would almost want to say that like Gen Z is a generation of nuns. Like, I just get the sense of like a general apathy to religion. Like, it's not like this is what we want for this to seem appealing. We just don't care for this. Like, you're trying to serve a dish that like we don't care to eat.
Okay.
So really, it's just about like reaffirming like why it matters. And I think maybe this is just a personal thing. Maybe this does speak to my generation. That's why like apologetics is so appealing, because it gives some of the why.
Yeah.
But yeah, it seems like you had a thought.
Okay, so I think actually the church potentially possesses something that Gen Z and younger is like desperate for, and they just have to figure out how to offer it to them. And I think what that is that I think modern people are getting increasingly lonely because of like replacing so much of connection with online connection. And even though I think that's a lot better than nothing, I don't think it fully does what humans need from human connection.
Yeah, I mean, if I can jump in for just 1 second.
Totally.
There's been all kinds of stuff that's been coming out, studies, thanks to the pandemic, of just like Zoom gatherings, like online connections. It literally doesn't do the same things to us physically as being in the same room as someone else.
Yeah.
And so as Gen Z, even without the pandemic, spends more and more of their time making connections, but not in the same room with people. They're literally not like, they're not developing, their brains aren't developing, their bodies aren't developing in the same way as people who had that.
And I mean, I'll even ask you guys, like, during the more lockdowny part of the pandemic, like, did you guys just experience feeling lonely despite meeting people online? Because I definitely did.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like, there's still people and you're still interacting with them, but it's not the same. But, wait, where was I going with that before? But like,
talking about the church had something that Gen Z desperately wanted and figured out how to offer it to them.
I think that's very true, because like, I think if you grow up like that, I assume it's just like very normal, because it's like, if online connection is just the new connection, and then maybe they just feel like, oh, I guess to be alive is to feel lonely and bad all the time because I'm connecting with people but I still feel awful. And I'm not saying that like, oh, we're just gonna like show them the error of their internet ways, but it's like there's more, you know? There's more you could be experiencing that could be very deeply fulfilling in your life. And I think like, I guess to summarize, church offers community, and I think people are in desperate need of community. And like, that sounds, I guess that's a little broad, and it's like anything could be a community, whether it has to do with Jesus or not. But it's like, that's clearly like, I think one of the most meaningful things church can offer to people.
Yeah.
And that, I don't know, if the church figured out how to show them what they're missing in some way, and I could go back to what Tony was saying of like having individual people who they trust and like kind of be those messengers to them, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think you made a great point. that really is the question, right? Is how do you get them to like come and see, like to just take that first step in and like realize? Because I do think it is like a what are you missing kind of situation. And I see that all the time with like some of the faith clubs that I help support. Like maybe these are kids that are just coming for the pizza or the whatever.
Yeah.
But like we get a lot of unchurched kids who are spending their lunch with us every single week.
Oh. That's cool.
Yeah, like honestly, like that's the coolest part of like these faith clubs is like I would say less than half the kids have ever stepped in a church or ever plan to step on a church, but they just see a community that's like consistent and regular and like acknowledges them, and like that's awesome.
And that's also a perfect example of like you came to them, like you're at their school.
Yeah.
You didn't like put a flyer for them to come to you. So like I'm sure you have getting much more people's attention by being there.
Yeah, I mean like, what was it? We've been running our youth group, doing a lot of cool stuff in our youth group. I think we've done a lot of really cool like advancements and upgrades to our youth group, and we've grown a little bit. We're sitting at like 11 to 13-ish people right now. Today on this first day of the club, of just like showing up, we had like 20 kids come. And like that just goes to show like when you're going to people, you reach so much more.
Yeah, and I mean honestly, that kind of answered the question of previously. Like maybe these Zoomers and younger, maybe they're not always hanging out like voluntarily at certain places like people used to do more. But if you know certain places where they're just forced to be, which is like at their high school or whatever, like even now college is kind of crazy that it can be so online where they're not even necessarily at the school at all.
Right.
But it's like, that's just like that's a very smart thing to do, which is just like if you know there's this huge group of unreached kids, just like put somebody there, like put a way to reach them there. Because it's like, here our church is located in the middle of PB, and sure there are like kids around the neighborhood or whatever, but it's not the same as being like in a school where there's just like a couple thousand kids right there, and they might just walk by and come in. So I think that's really a genius example of just getting to where they are.
Yeah, and this kind of goes back to your question of like, what is the equivalent of authenticity to millennials? Like, what is that to Gen Z? This kind of just came to me in this conversation. I don't even know like what the word would be, but like if I was allowed to use a phrase like love for love's sake, or like no strings attached, or like
unconditional love.
Unconditional, yeah, like that's a great way to put it too. Of like when we can offer things to these people. I want to say kids, but we're not all necessarily kids anymore. But to these young people, just for the sake of doing something good to them or doing something loving to them, I think that really turns heads. I think we see that at the bottle service, how we do.
Yeah.
I think that's what we see at these clubs. There's a church in Point Loma that is grown tremendously quickly among like young people, and they host a dodgeball tournament like twice a year. And it's just like a come like hang out, and play dodgeball. Like winning team gets a huge cash prize. Kids like pay to get in, so like it pays for itself. It's like a whole like thing.
Wow. That's cool.
But like it's not like a like come to church, like we'll do a message afterwards. Like no, it's like come play this dodgeball tournament on our church campus. And like just like come meet us for who we are, and then if you like what we're about, like maybe come back next week when we're doing the more traditional like youth group stuff. Yeah,
because like I think one of the biggest reasons anybody would like continue to participate in any kind of community is because there's a person or people there who they like and connect with. It's like maybe in some extreme cases you would participate in some activity all by yourself with like no social interaction just because you love the activity so much, but it's like it's going to be a lot more likely, I think, for people to stay involved if they like have friends or they make friends or they're just like, I like this person or I like these people and I just want to hang out with them and this is where I do that, so I come to this. And like, I don't know, that's just another thing that I think that is of tremendous value that can be offered to people by the church.
Yeah. You've been silent for a minute, Grant. Do you have any thoughts on this stuff?
No, well, I think the last thought that I had, based on what you were talking about a moment ago, is maybe something that and I'll say broadly, we as church leaders need to embrace when ministering to young people is like really embracing the unconditionality of it, right? Like by which I mean not expecting anything in return for what we do, because I think first it's very hard to, again, especially when you work in ministry, right? Like oftentimes the the pressures are like, why aren't we seeing more people show up on Sunday morning or to Roots or to wherever, right?
You grade yourself on the results.
Right. And unfortunately the result more often than not is like a numerical people in the seats at a church service or at a youth group or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if part of what Gen Z needs is the unconditionality of love and offering something with nothing expected in return, like learning to be okay with we gave, we loved, and
that's the win.
That's it. That was the win right there.
Yeah.
Exactly. Whether or not we ever talk to that person again, that was the win on its own.
Yeah, and kind of on that note, I had this almost like an epiphany when I was talking to this faith club, because a lot of the kids that came for just the pizza, and again, like these were not like a churched group.
Yeah.
And I was trying to like get my like final last minute like sell to them of like why they should come back in future weeks. And what I ultimately like landed on as I was like talking to them was like, hey guys, like this is a faith club, and we come here and like we leaders are like in support of our faith because we think it's like healthy and good and will like ultimately be helpful to you. But ultimately what this club is really about is establishing a loving, consistent community for you all where you will consistently be welcomed and cared for and treated well. And I think that message lands. And I think like we as church leaders know that like their relationship with God is immeasurably important. But I don't think that message necessarily connects with people. I don't think people necessarily realize the value of their relationship with Christ.
Yeah.
And we might need to like get them with something else first so we can later.
Yeah, get their foot in the door.
Yeah.
Because especially if they're growing up like unchurched and maybe even their parents are unchurched, because that's been more common for a long time now. It's like it used to be like part of the cultural understanding that like generally like God is good and Christianity is good and the Bible is good and that kind of stuff. But now like people could even think the opposite or just be totally neutral. So it's like you don't have this like pre-laid foundation all the time, and then it's like what you said, where it's like maybe you need another way to kind of get your foot in the door.
Right. Man, I think well, so ultimately we kind of got all over the place. But the question that originally asked was, is the church still relevant / is relevant to young people? I would argue that yes, it is. Or yes, it should be, but often in its current execution is not.
In practice.
In practice. Yeah, and I don't know if you guys necessarily agree with those sentiments or that answer, but...
No, I do, and I want to make a quick connection actually to something that's been around in like theological circles for a long time, which is the idea of missional church theology, which is essentially that like treating the world around you in America or North America, wherever you live, as the mission field, right? Like to do missionary work, we don't need to go somewhere else.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And especially this connects back to the last thing you were saying, Robert. That like this has already been true for a while, but it's grown and grown more and more and more. That you just encounter more and more people who have not even necessarily a negative connotation about church, but literally like
an apathetic one.
Well, none like literally none in that they do not know what we're talking about.
There's now like people who don't know what the 10 Commandments are. They like literally haven't heard of them or something.
Who like don't understand what the little T is if someone's wearing a cross on their neck.
That's
right? Like this is what we're talking about. It's not like apathetic towards church, but like literally unchurched to the extreme of like imagine a person who's never heard the gospel before.
Yeah.
There's plenty of people like that out here right now, you know? And we're not used to that idea because, again, like you were saying, Robert, we are used to, culturally, America being at least pseudo-Christian, right? At least like surface level, assuming that because it's a somewhat Christian society, or at least vaguely so, that everyone at least has a vague connection to Christianity, even if it is a negative one, or again, a rejection or an apathetic one, that they have a relationship to Christianity. But we're talking about more and more people who just straight up do not have a connection to Christianity, period. Not a good one, not a bad one, not an apathetic one, just not one. And so what missional church theology talks about is treating our church, Roots, PP Pres, whatever you want to call it, as a mission church, basically, a mission field church, right? And how would that reshape the way we do things, right? Because a missionary, you can't go to a new culture, put up a building, hang your shingle over the door, and expect people to show up on Sunday morning for worship, right? You have to do the work of as you were saying, explaining why it's valuable in the first place, like what's important about it. You have to do the work of building relationships so that they understand that like you're someone who loves them and cares about them. And then, after all that work, maybe some of those people will come to a church service you hold on Sunday morning, if that's even something you do, right?
Yeah.
But, so anyway, that's just something that this whole conversation has made me think about, is that like, a lot of our, but to add to that, a lot of our missional church, like, a lot of the missional church work is at this point like 40, 50 years old, right? So it's even that is talking about a culture that doesn't exist anymore. And so what we really need to do is think about how to be missional for the modern generation, for Gen Z, for Gen Alpha, whatever comes next, rather than continuing to use even what used to be like cutting edge missional thinking, but that was good for millennials maybe, or Gen Xers even,
Yeah, because now, like kind of the whole life shifting to online thing, like you're gonna have to take that into account.
So I guess my answer to the question is absolutely. I think as anyone who's watched a single episode of this podcast will know, I think the church is incredibly important and valuable and should be part of everyone's life.
Yeah.
And so it's up to us, right, to figure out how to not lose the core of what makes church,
right,
while being missional about it, where in our culture.
Yeah, and we've talked a lot about the church as a whole, like the capital T church, or capital T, the church.
The silent T.
Church. The church. Capital T, the church. And how relevant it is to Gen Z still. I mean, we haven't even gotten into the conversation. I don't know necessarily have time to. Maybe part two in the future.
We probably have to wrap it up pretty soon.
I honestly didn't even check what time we started, to be honest. So, but we didn't even begin the conversation of like how do we make Sunday morning more appropriate. And I say Sunday morning, I guess people that work for a Sunday night service. How do we make our church services more appealing and more relevant to young people?
I have a thought about that, which is like Grant was just saying a minute ago that like we need to, I guess like, I don't remember the exact phrase, but he said something about like the core of what church is.
Yeah, not lose the core of what church is. Yeah.
Not lose the core of what the church is, but that makes me think maybe the church should lose some things that are not core. Because it's like, I don't know, certainly the way we grew up, and like probably Tony as well, it's like there's a very clear conception of what a church service is and what it should be. But then if you imagine all these people who grew up very unchurched and they're like religious nuns, they don't have any conception of that, and then it's like, if you just kind of like try to fit them into the mold of what everything used to be like, it's like, are we doing that because it's the best way to reach them, or are we doing that just because that's how people used to do things and it's easier not to change it, And it's like, I think that's a serious thing to think about like, figuring out what is actually the real necessary core of what it should be, and then like, as much as possible, making that what's going to reach those people the most, and not holding on to tradition for the sake of it when it could be counterproductive for some people.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a firm believer that I wish church looked more like youth group, to be honest.
Yeah.
I wish the dedicated teaching time was shorter, because my attention span is much shorter.
Yep.
And you're not alone. That's true of most people in Gen Z and millennials.
My attention span is shrinking. It's honestly really hard for me to engage with a long message. No matter how compelling the speaker is, like, it is just difficult for me.
Yeah.
I wish that there was a higher social component that involved more like distinct fellowship time and hanging out.
I agree with that too.
And like cooperative activity, whether that's like dodgeball or something else, right? But like honestly, like I agree with you. Like I don't think we need to like stay so married to a lot of stuff that isn't core to a church service. And for an unchurched population, absolutely.
And like Grant was saying earlier that like to millennials, like the kind of like the high church kind of thing could be very appealing. But I guess it's like worth asking if that would still be true for the next generation after that, because then it's possible by like what you're doing at church, you might be like attracting one group but repelling another group just by the nature of what they're interested in or whatever.
Yeah. Well, and that's why I think we need a variety of like churches, right? We can't.
Yeah, that's true. Can't please them all.
That's the beauty of the capital T, capital C church. What we're talking about is obviously many congregations.
Yeah.
Right? We're not talking about just our congregation, right? We're talking about the church. Right. And so, like, there might be a world where there's a church that appeals to millennials and Gen Zers, right? But it's also possible that if they need very different things, or they want very different things, that they can both engage with church. It just won't be the same congregations necessarily all the time.
Actually, then that could be a way to reframe our original question, which is like, is the church as it traditionally has been relevant to young Christians now? Because then it's not the capital T, capital C. It's like just what the church has become in America. Is that relevant to young people? Because maybe it could be relevant if it changed, but maybe it's not relevant if it doesn't change.
Yeah, and see, that's a tough question too, because I wonder. So I would answer no. It's like a gut take.
Yeah.
But am I answering no as a SoCal Christian in San Diego? Like would a Christian in Alabama or Texas or like more traditional? Like in the Bible Belt, like would they feel like here's a good example, purely anecdotal, the best kind of evidence. I have a good friend of mine who is not a believer. He's like an avowed atheist. But he grew up in the Bible Belt, and he actually very much enjoys traditional church services.
Interesting.
And still goes to traditional church services that he grew up in a Southern Baptist environment because he really enjoys it, even though he is an atheist. He's a young person, just like me.
Yeah.
And I imagine like those populations exist too.
That's interesting because I've heard of that already a lot, but more associated with Judaism. But there's a lot of people who intentionally are like culturally practicing Jews, but they don't necessarily believe it's true very much. But it's interesting to see that maybe also become more of a thing in Christianity, because I hadn't heard very much of that really before right now. So that's interesting to hear.
Yeah, I mean, for him, a lot of it is just like it was something that he grew up doing. It was like the culture is still there of like valuing church, even if he doesn't necessarily believe in what they're saying.
Yeah, because I mean, there's still other things to value, like meeting together with all the people in your community and like I don't know, like socializing, singing together.
Yeah, like we were talking about, right? That a lot of people need community somewhere. So if that's the only need it's meeting, we would argue not enough for what church is supposed to be, but it is a valuable thing, you know?
Right. But yeah, which is all to say, like, I want to answer yes, that the traditional church is not working for young people today.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's universally true. And I think what really, my greater point is I want to see greater diversity in what the lowercase TC church looks like, so that a greater range of young people can be served adequately.
Yeah.
Kind of like, I know you and I have talked about this a lot. I would love to see people not have to like force themselves into like the wrong peg, right?
Yeah.
I would love to see people find a church that fits them for who they are.
Yeah, like it's a big ask these days if you're trying to get people to come to your thing and they don't it's not specifically tailored to them, but they're just gonna be like, oh well, this is the closest thing I can find, so I'll do it anyway. Like I think theoretically it's much more effective to reach them with something where they objectively are just like, wow, this seems like it was made for me, I enjoy being here. Like
that's why the internet's so appealing. It is a peg that we have made to fit ourselves like extensively.
Yeah.
And so like we need to get people like out of their hole that fits them super well by hopefully finding an environment that also fits them.
Yeah.
Hopefully almost as well.
Now, of course, this leads to all sorts of other questions that I don't think we have time for today.
Right.
Which is like, obviously, if you then start treating church like that, you create siloed churches that don't interact, and cross-generational things are super important, and making sure that churches aren't like so uniform in the type of person who goes there that they have huge blind spots, that kind of stuff. But that's a whole other topic. That could be a part 2 conversation.
Hey, I'm down for part 2. I think there's a lot more to talk about.
Yeah.
Sometime.
And obviously something the 3 of us are all passionate about.
Yeah. Man, I'm gonna hold myself back. There's a point I want to make so badly.
Let's do this. Let's do final thoughts on what's already been talked about. No new topics. Final thoughts, and then before we close in prayer. So
I have something to save for part 2.
Okay. All right. Well, so save it for part 2. But any final closing thoughts on what we've said so far?
I don't know. I think we actually touched on some really good stuff today. I guess the things that stick out to me are like Tony saying like going where the people are, and I guess just this idea of like what can be changed, because it's like I don't think like the specific conception of how a church service used to work is all like completely necessary and like set in stone and unchangeable. And I'm actually intrigued by the idea that maybe some changes like that, like maybe like less teaching, more social time, or whatever you might do, those could honestly just like make church more effective. And even though we grew up with it being different, that's not necessarily like sacrilege.
Yeah.
So I'm honestly interested to see things like that happening and hopefully like be involved in them happening.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say, like, I hope I not give the impression that I want, like, the church to, like, jettison all the old people. Or, like, I want young people to go, like, found their new churches for just young people. Like Grant kind of touched on, I'm a firm believer that intergenerationality being a multi-generational church is effective, and studies show that is actually one of the things that keeps young people in the church and from leaving the church is having a multi-generational church where each generation is firmly represented and involved and interacting with one another. That was one of the biggest things that kept kids from not leaving church when they went to college.
Cool.
So I just want to make sure I didn't misrepresent myself and my thoughts on what the church should look like.
But I think ultimately, to wrap up, I think a lot of what both of you guys have said is super important, and I think, there's one takeaway from all this, right? It's that a lot of young people not only aren't in church, but like literally have no relationship to the church whatsoever.
Yeah.
And that it's valuable for us to think about how we can be the church, not by like creating our own spaces necessarily, but by figuring out how to inhabit the spaces that already exist, by figuring out how to, as you were saying, like offer unconditionally and not like be so concerned with like making sure we're hitting a numbers quota or anything like that. Making sure that we're not sticking to outdated ways of doing things. There's a lot here to take away from this. I know we've talked about a lot, but ultimately I think the answer to the original question is the church should be.
Yeah.
It may not be, but it should be. And there are ways to do it.
It could be.
It could be. There's nothing out there that says it couldn't be in the future if people are willing to try.
And I'm sure there are churches out there that are doing a great job.
I'm sure there are.
But why don't I go ahead and close this episode in prayer? Throw your hands out, Grant. Would you like to?
No, you take it.
Okay,
Grant, you take it.
Fair enough. All right. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord God, we thank you for the opportunity to have these conversations, God. And we pray that we have further opportunity to continue having these conversations because they are important, Lord. And Lord, we just pray that you continue to work as you often do in spite of us, God. Lord, we all know that while we're all striving to create a church and environment that is suitable and effective and good for your children, Lord, that you would just bless us with wisdom in that endeavor, Lord, the courage to try new things, God, and the strength to continue even when we are failing by our own metrics, Father. Lord, I just thank you again that we are all in positions of ministering to young people, God, that we have been blessed with young people within our ministries that we can pour into, Lord, that we can help grow closer to you. Father, we thank you for this time, and we appreciate and thank you again for all the blessings that you've given us. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Peace out, guys.
See y'all next week.